There's a lake in the American West that was supposed to be dead. The water had turned, the oxygen was gone, the fish had vanished, and the people who depended on it were watching it collapse in real time. So the government made a decision, not a small one. They loaded up planes, trucks, and tankers and released millions of live fish into that dying body of water. It was one of the largest aquatic restoration operations in American history, and for a while it looked like it was working. The fish survived, the lake responded, the ecosystem began to shift. But ecosystems don't just respond to help, they respond to everything. And what came next wasn't what any of the scientists predicted. The lake didn't just recover, it transformed. And that transformation set off a chain reaction that is still playing out today, affecting water supplies, local communities, wildlife corridors, and government policy across multiple states. This is the story of what happens when humans try to save nature, and nature decides to rewrite the rules. The lake was called Pyramid Lake. Sitting in the Nevada desert, northeast of Reno, it had once been one of the most remarkable freshwater ecosystems in North America. Deep, cold, and ancient, formed from the remnants of a prehistoric inland sea that once covered much of the Great Basin. For thousands of years, it sustained life on a scale most people never associate with the desert. The Paiute people had lived along its shores for generations. Their entire way of life was built around one fish, the Lahontan cutthroat trout, a species that could grow to over 40 pounds, one of the largest trout ever to exist in North America. But by the mid-20th century, that fish was gone. Not declining, not endangered, gone. The last confirmed Lahontan cutthroat in Pyramid Lake was recorded in 1944. What killed it wasn't a drought, it wasn't pollution, it was a dam. Built upstream on the Truckee River in 1905, the Derby Dam diverted water away from the lake for agricultural irrigation. Over decades, the water level dropped dramatically. The river channel that the trout needed to spawn dried up completely. With no way to reproduce, the population collapsed one generation at a time, and nobody stopped it. By the time scientists understood what was happening, the fish was already functionally extinct in the wild. The lake didn't die all at once. It died quietly, over 40 years, while everyone looked the other way. But in the 1970s, a small group of researchers made a discovery that changed the entire situation, and what they found had been hiding in plain sight for decades. In 1976, a fisheries biologist named Robert Bank got a tip, not from a government agency, not from a research institution, from a hatchery worker in Pilot Peak, Utah, a man who had been quietly maintaining a small, isolated population of trout for decades. Bank drove out to see it himself. What he found was extraordinary. A surviving strain of Lahontan cutthroat trout, genetically intact, biologically pure, living in a small, cold water creek in the middle of the Utah desert. Nobody had cataloged them. Nobody had protected them. They had simply survived, cut off from the rest of the world, in a creek so remote that no one had thought to look there. Bank ran the genetic analysis. The results confirmed it. These were the real fish, the original Pyramid Lake strain. Not a hybrid, not a substitute, the exact species that had vanished from Pyramid Lake 30 years earlier. It was, by any scientific measure, one of the most significant fisheries discoveries of the 20th century, and almost no one heard about it. The question now wasn't whether the fish existed, it was whether Pyramid Lake could sustain them again. The water chemistry had shifted, the spawning channels were still damaged, the dam was still diverting flow. Restocking a lake that wasn't ready could kill every single fish within a season. But the Paiute tribe had already waited 30 years. They weren't willing to wait much longer. So in 1979, the operation began, and the scale of it shocked even the people running it. The first stocking run carried over 50,000 juvenile trout, transported in oxygenated tanker trucks, driven through the Nevada desert, released into a lake that hadn't held this species in over 3 decades. The biologists watched the water and waited. The first sign was subtle. The fish didn't scatter immediately. They held near the surface, adjusting to the temperature, the salinity, the unfamiliar depth of open water. Then they dove and disappeared into the lake. For weeks, nobody knew if they were surviving or dying. There were no tracking systems advanced enough to follow them at scale. The researchers had to wait for the water to tell them. 3 months later, the first large cutthroat was pulled from Pyramid Lake by a Paiute fisherman named David Numana. It weighed 11 pounds. He had fished that lake his entire life and never once caught this species. His father hadn't either. Word spread fast. By the following season, the fish were appearing across the lake in numbers no one had projected. The restocking was working. But then the biologists pulled the population data from the second year, and something in the numbers didn't add up. The fish were growing faster than the lake's food supply should have allowed. Much faster, which meant one of two things. Either the lake's ecosystem had recovered beyond all expectation, or the trout were consuming something that no one had accounted for. Something that was already living in that lake. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. The answer came from a net sample taken in the summer of 1982. A junior researcher named Craig Thiessen was cataloging the lake's invertebrate population, routine work, the kind nobody pays much attention to. But what came up in his net stopped him cold. Tui chub. Millions of them. A small, native baitfish that had quietly colonized Pyramid Lake during the decades the trout were gone. With no natural predator, they had multiplied beyond anything the ecosystem was designed to support. They had consumed the zooplankton, disrupted the food chain, and fundamentally altered the biological structure of the lake. Nobody had noticed because nobody had been looking. The trout weren't thriving because the lake had recovered. They were thriving because they had found an almost unlimited food source, and they were consuming it at a rate the lake couldn't sustain. Here was the twist no one saw coming. The very fish introduced to save the lake were now accelerating a secondary collapse. The tui chub population began crashing by 1984. And as the chub disappeared, the trout growth rates dropped sharply. Smaller fish, fewer fish. A lake that had looked recovered suddenly looked fragile again. The biologists were now facing a problem they hadn't created, but one they were responsible for managing. And the only real solution required something far more controversial than releasing fish into a lake. It required removing them, millions of them, from a lake that an entire community had spent decades trying to restore. The Paiute Tribal Council was called into an emergency meeting, and the decision made in that room would divide the community for years. The decision was not simple. Removing the tui chub meant large-scale electrofishing operation, running electrical current through sections of the lake to stun and collect the baitfish in controlled numbers. It had never been attempted at this scale in a lake this size. The tribal council approved it, but only after one elder, a man named Raymond Thacker, stood up in that meeting and said something that silenced the room. He said the lake had already survived one generation of mistakes.
The lake has survived enough mistakes.
It couldn't survive another. The operation ran through 1985 and 1986. Dozens of boats, hundreds of work hours, tons of tui chub removed from the shallows and mid-depths. And it worked. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly the zooplankton returned. The food chain stabilized. The trout population began regulating itself naturally. By 1990, Pyramid Lake held one of the healthiest self-sustaining Lahontan cutthroat populations in the world. A species that had been functionally extinct in this lake was now reproducing on its own. Without intervention, without stalking, without human management. But here is what makes this story genuinely worth remembering. The fish didn't just come back. The water rights battle triggered by the restoration effort forced a landmark legal agreement in 1990, compelling upstream water users to release minimum flows back into the Truckee River. For the first time in nearly a century, the river reached the lake again. Not partially, fully, the spawning channels reopened naturally. And in the spring of 1995, rangers documented the first wild spawning run of Lahontan cutthroat trout up the Truckee River, a sight no living person had ever seen before. It had taken 50 years, 3 government agencies, 1 tribal nation, and millions of fish. But Pyramid Lake came back. Not because nature is resilient, though it is, but because a small group of people refused to accept that extinction was permanent. If this story stayed with you, you know what to do. There are more of these waiting.